Chapter 2, Mina. Nice to see you remember me, and it's Mina, not Minnie, Mina stated coldly. Ouch, he was going to have freezer burn by the time she got through freezing him out, and it still wouldn't make up for the past 5 years. Table or booth? She picked up a menu and stepped around the hostess station to lead him to his choice of seating arrangement. If she had her choice, that seating arrangement would be out the door and maybe across the continent for good measure. At least he had the decency to look appropriately ashamed. Max put his hands in his pockets and rocked back onto his heels. Mina remembered this as something he would do when he was nervous. She had called him out on it many times in the past, in fact. Well, good. She was glad she wasn't the only one feeling discomfort here. I would hope that a man would remember his wife, Max stated quietly. Wife. Did that word still apply to her? They may not be divorced on paper, but he had left no room for negotiation on that when he skipped out of town 5 years ago and hadn't spoken to her since. Then the divorce papers had come in the mail. I'm not sure if you have the right to call me that anymore. Table or booth, Mina stated firmly. Set your boundaries and stick to them. That's what all the self-help books she had read told her to do. Easier said than done. Come on, Minnie, can we talk, please? Max reached out to place a hand on her arm, but thought better of it when she jerked quickly away from him. He let his arm drop back to his side, hurt evident in his eyes. Yeah, well, get used to it, buddy. Don't call me that, she snapped at him, irritated that he continued to use his old nickname for her. Yes, Mina had never signed the divorce papers, so yes, technically they were still married. But that didn't mean he could worm his way back into her life with cutesy nicknames and fake remorse. Max had been the only person she had allowed to call her Minnie, other than her mom before she passed away. A right he lost when he had stomped all over the heart she had given him the day after they tied the knot. He may have been willing to rush into ending the marriage that God had united them in. Mina, on the other hand, was not so impetuous. Though if she didn't get some space from him in the next 2 minutes, she was going to scream, or cry, or hyperventilate, possibly a combination of all three. Max smirked as if he knew the effect he was having on her. He really shouldn't be smirking like that right now with the way she was treating him. However, he had always liked that he could bring out that fiery spark in her eyes when he triggered her temper. There weren't many things that could get her temper going, but Max Morgan was one of them. Table or booth, she repeated flatly. Is there a problem here? Pete asked, appearing next to Mina. Max quickly stepped back and looked warily at Pete. Mina didn't blame him. At 6'5", Pete was an intimidating man for anyone who didn't know him. To those that did know him, he was all bark and rarely any bite, a big teddy bear, really. Mina silently thanked Pete for his impeccable timing. No, we're fine, she reassured him. Pete had taken care of some unruly customers who had hassled her in the past. It didn't happen often, but she knew he wouldn't hesitate to step in and remove Max from their premises if she asked. It was a tempting thought, but she wasn't petty, and she knew that Max would never physically harm her. Emotionally, sure, he had set off an emotional bomb when he took off the day after their wedding, 5 years ago. Physically, though, never. Mr. Morgan here was just having trouble deciding if he wanted a table or a booth. Mina looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. Max cleared his throat, looking curiously at Pete as he stood protectively over her. Mina almost laughed at the jealousy written all over Max's face. He thought Pete was her boyfriend. Of course, he couldn't know that Pete was happily married with 5 children. She could actually see the two of them being friends, if he hadn't left. She was curious about the jealousy, though. He had left her. Why would he care if she had moved on? Maybe it was one of those cases of, I don't want her, but I don't want anyone else to have her either. It wasn't an attitude she would have ever suspected him of harboring, though she had clearly been wrong about his attitude toward her in the past. Booth, please. Mina nodded at Pete to reassure him that she was fine, and he retreated back to the kitchen. She led the way to a booth in the back and motioned for Max to take a seat. If only she could kick him out without Verna getting mad. Since that wasn't likely, she glanced back toward the kitchen again, contemplating an excuse to spend as little time with him alone as possible. She saw Pete watching them, still on guard, bless him. Not wanting him to continue worrying, Mina gave him a shooing wave, and he reluctantly turned back to his stove and got to work on preparing orders. What are you doing here? She asked Max as she turned back to him and handed him his menu. He gazed up into her brown eyes, pondering how to answer her question. It's dinner time and I was hungry, Max said to her cautiously, yet Mina could detect playfulness in his tone. She rolled her eyes. This was just like him, trying to diffuse a tense situation with sarcasm. Max, I'm being serious. What are you doing back in Maple Falls? He plucked his shirt away from his body, drawing her eyes to what he was wearing. The uniform didn't clue you in? I actually just took the job as the new police chief, he said. Great, she groaned. She had missed the uniform he was wearing when she first saw him walk in. So you're back indefinitely then? He nodded. Wonderful, just great, she thought to herself. She silently contemplated the realistic possibility of them both living in a town the size of Maple Falls and being able to avoid each other, slim to none. She didn't want to move again, though. She didn't want to lose the sense of home that Maple Falls gave her. "How long have you been back?" Max asked her, smiling good-naturedly and not sensing her inner turmoil. "Oh, no, you don't, mister. You don't get to play nice as if the past 5 years didn't happen." "A while," Mina said vaguely. "Did you know that I worked here?" Maybe he had looked her up and that was really his motivation for returning. That brought her up short. Could he have found out her secret? The thought sent a burst of anxiety spiking through her. She didn't think so. However, she imagined, as law enforcement, he would have the resources to look her up if he were so inclined. She wasn't sure if this was something that would come up in a typical background check, but she certainly didn't want to give him the chance to find out. "No, honestly, I didn't," he said, noting her reaction and looking upset that the thought of him searching her out would cause her to be upset. "Mina, I'm sorry. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I can leave if that would be better." Mina stared at him, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. She would love for him to leave, but was that really fair? Vernon needed the business, and it's not like she could keep him from a public establishment. She was bigger than that. Finally, she sighed and shook her head, pulling her notepad from her apron. "No, it's fine. What can I get you to eat?" "Whatever you would recommend," he replied, handing the menu back to her without even really looking to see what they served. She nodded and took his menu. She walked quickly back to the kitchen, feeling his gaze on her the whole way. Once out of sight, she leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to calm her heart that had started racing again. Why would he come back here if he didn't know she lived here? His parents had moved away. She had made sure of that before moving back here herself. Mina had never been a big fan of his parents, and there had been rumors when they were in school that his dad was a mean drunk. He had always hidden the fact from her, though, if it were true. He had skirted around the topic often enough when they were growing up that she suspected it was, however. It would explain why he was always hanging out at her house. In fact, now that she thought about it, most of the people they had gone to school with had moved on. Maple Falls wasn't a town many would choose to stay in if they had other opportunities. And becoming the town police chief? That was the least likely career choice she would have pegged him to take. She couldn't picture him being strapped down to a desk and paperwork kind of job, and she knew from her work before moving that law enforcement involved a lot of that, especially on the administrative side. Max had always been someone who could never sit still, always on the move. And then Mina wondered how he, someone who hadn't lived in the town for the past 5 years, became the chief over the deputies who were currently on the force. Luke had been there for at least 5 or 6 years. She couldn't remember exactly, but she did vaguely remember his mom bragging about him graduating the academy and coming back to work for the town before she had left. None of her business about the reasons why, she supposed. "Are you sure there's nothing wrong?" She opened her eyes to see Pete watching her, concern etched on his face. Mina smiled at him, hoping that it looked more convincing than it felt. Pete had no idea the havoc that having Max in town could stir up in her life. "Yes, everything is fine. Just needed a breather for a minute." What would she do without Pete? He had been such a blessing in her life since she had returned. Pete nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He respected her privacy, however, and didn't push further. "What did he order?" he asked, changing the topic to one that, under normal circumstances, should have been less emotionally filled. Little did he know the emotions that ran through her as she thought about his question. "Plain cheeseburger, extra cheese, curly fries, ranch on the side for dipping the fries." "I'll get his drink," she rattled off. She tried to tell herself it didn't mean anything that she remembered his favorite order. Pete walked off to fix the food, casting one last glance at her. She shook her head to clear away the shock of it all and poured him a sweet tea. She walked back out to his table, trying to ignore the way her eyes were drawn to his uniform. He was absorbed in responding to something on his phone and didn't hear her approach. Really, shouldn't he be more aware of his surroundings as the new chief? "Here you go," she said, placing the glass in front of him and working to keep her tone civil. He glanced up from his phone and smiled at her. "Thanks, Minnie. Sorry, I mean Mina," he said, holding up a hand to ward off her protest. "You're welcome," she replied, and started to walk away. She chose to ignore the slip on her name. She wasn't sure if it were an actual slip or an attempt to get under her skin. If it was the latter, she wasn't going to let him get to her. Max grabbed her hand and gently tugged her to a stop before she could escape. Mina swiftly pulled her hand from his, hating the spark of electricity that ran up her arm at his touch. "Is something wrong with the tea?" He shook his head and looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Can we talk, please, Mina? I know I hurt you. I'd like to try to explain." She considered his request. Did she want an explanation? Thankfully, she was interrupted before she could formulate an answer. "Excuse me, miss, could we get a refill on our soda? Our son spilled his," a customer called to her from across the dining area. Mina had never been more thankful for a spilled soda in her life. She turned to the source of the mess and smiled, a genuine one this time. "I'll be right there," she said. She had almost forgotten she had other customers to wait on. She found it irritating that being around Max could still make everything around her lose focus. She turned back to Max and let some of that irritation leak through in her tone. "I'll be right back with your food." He sighed and nodded. She made her way to the kitchen and went to clean up the mess the toddler had produced. She was suddenly extra thankful for the busyness of the afternoon. Other than bringing him his food and occasionally checking in to make sure everything was to his liking, as a good waitress would, she didn't have an opportunity for Max to approach her again for an answer. Part of her wanted the answers, yes. Mina had wanted the answer for the past 5 years. Who gets married and then less than 24 hours later leaves you a note saying they don't love you and can't make it work? The other part of her had come to terms with never getting that answer and being okay with it. Could she cope with reopening that wound when it was just starting to heal? Did God have a purpose for Max coming back into her life now? She had prayed countless times since the dramatic conclusion of their marriage for help in getting closure. Maybe this was it, a chance for closure. Or was it a chance for something more? Would she even want that? She didn't think she wanted to know the answer to that question. As the afternoon wound to a close and the sunset of shorter days began to sink over the horizon, she flipped the open sign off and began cashing out the remaining customers. Max was last in line. Mina gave him his total, avoiding his gaze once again, and he held out his credit card. "Coward," she scolded herself. "You look tired," he commented as he signed his receipt, a concerned look in his gaze. Mina laughed. He always had been blunt, never beating around the bush with what he wanted to say. It was something she had appreciated once upon a time. "Wow, thanks. That is so charming." He smiled at her and handed back the pen she had given him, his fingers brushing hers in the process. She felt her cheeks heat. "I didn't mean that in a bad way," he replied. "Just that you look like you've had a busy day. Is it always like this?" "Fairly often, yes," she replied, refusing to make this easier for him by being a chatty Cathy. "You remembered my order," he noted with a smirk. Mina rolled her eyes. "Max, we've known each other since we were in 4th grade. It's not that surprising that I would remember. You always order the same thing." It was something she had teased him about often. He was a creature of habit. Well, except when it came to their marriage. That was a habit he seemed to have no problem breaking. Though could you call it a habit if it only lasted a number of hours? "Hey, there's nothing wrong with being predictable. I look at it as being dependable," he defended. Mina snorted. "Oh yeah, that's totally you, Mr. Predictable and Dependable." Max sheepishly rubbed the back of his neck and looked away for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "Can we talk, please?" he pleaded with her. She should have known he wouldn't let it go. That was another annoying habit of his. He was stubborn, especially when it came to something involving her. Well, before he left, anyway. She searched for any malicious intent in his eyes, but found only remorse, however sincere that may be. Still, it wasn't only her heart she was protecting now. They shared more than a failed marriage, though of course Max was unaware of that, and she had hoped to never have the need to share that with him. However, with him being back in town, it was only a matter of time before he figured it out. It was probably better that she tell him anyway, than allow the shock to influence the fallout. Better to rip the Band-Aid off all at once, so to speak. How do you tell someone they have a daughter they have never met? She didn't think the local library carried a book on that, but she was sure going to check. "Not tonight. I need to get home and I'm tired." And she had a babysitter who charged extra for every hour over the agreed-upon time. He smiled. "Okay, that's fine. What are you doing tomorrow?" "Working, but I have a break around dinner time." She was working in the day at the diner and then the evening at the hospital. She could sandwich their meeting in between, then that would give her an excuse to leave if things got tense. And how could they not when she dropped the news on him? "Okay, that's perfect. Can I come pick you up?" Mina almost laughed at his enthusiasm. It was a trait that she used to find attractive in him, and maybe still did. If she let herself acknowledge that, though, which of course she would not be doing. "No, I can just meet you here." Better to meet somewhere neutral, and she didn't want him to know where she lived. Not until she was ready for him to know about their daughter. Though if he thought about it, he could probably guess where she was living. She hadn't been too secretive when picking where to settle down in Maple Falls, though she hadn't really had much of a choice either with her finances what they were. "I'll take what I can get. Can I have your phone number?" he asked. Mina raised an eyebrow at him and he laughed, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "Just to check and make sure you don't decide to cancel between now and then. I won't stalk you. Police officer, remember?" Mina couldn't suppress the involuntary shiver of fear that his statement brought. Max gave her a curious look but didn't comment. He's in jail, she told herself. She could feel the beginnings of a headache coming on. She needed to get him out of there just in case it was the signal of a panic attack. There was no reason for him to witness that. "The number hasn't changed," she said frostily. She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him to show himself out. When she came back out with her cleaning supplies, he was gone. Mina breathed a sigh of relief and got to work. An hour later, she waved goodbye to Pete and climbed into her car. She was so ready to be home. This had to be one of the longest days of her life.